our world panel. I'm He Gang. I'm now studying and working at the Oath Institute in Columbia University. So it's my honor to be here to serve as the moderator. As you will see in your agenda, actually, we will have very distinguished experts on world issues. So if you see the schedule, you'll see the very diversified topics and also to cover diversified areas in China. So I'm not truly an expert on world issues, but I'm a sincere learner here. So in China, we have saying that 初生牛犊不怕虎, newly born cow don't fear tigers. So please join me to welcome our tigers. Our first speaker will be Professor Peter Perdue. So he will introduce his long research on the historic and his water research on historic materials. So, thanks. Please.
Well, now for something completely different. I'm an environmental historian of China, and the only historian on this program. I know you're all interested in studying China's contemporary environmental problems and very interested in the future, but I hope you'd be interested in a little bit of reflection on China's past. When I hear the word past used in this conference, I think it generally the longest term I've heard referred to is about the last 20 years. We have in mind in the historical past of China a somewhat longer time perspective. Mostly in this talk it will be about 200 years, but you could easily go back 2,000 years. The basic argument I will make very briefly is all of the things you've heard about so far, all this stuff has happened before. All major questions on China's environmental policy have been addressed by Chinese officials hundreds of years ago. This includes issues like the sustainability of agrarian systems, the health of the rural population, and especially, as repeatedly comes up, obtaining accurate information from local levels and implementing central government policy through local actors. China has the oldest continuous bureaucratic state in the world. It goes back to 200 BC. It's had recurring issues of environmental management ever since, and these issues provide a rich legacy that contemporary policymakers and analysts could draw on to resolve urgent challenges today. Historians tell stories, but I call them analytical narratives sometimes, not just stories. We look at some specific cases and processes in the past, which I think have some relevance to the present. We have a couple of advantages. We have many disadvantages compared to modern social scientists and policy people, the biggest one being that our subjects are dead. On the other hand, they can't talk back either, and that's an advantage. But we do know how the story came out in the past. And we do have good archives on many of these questions. There really is a lot of data in the Chinese archives on things like population, land clearance, water conservancy, even temperature, rainfall, famines, floods, disease, and there's a considerable amount of discussion about it by imperial courts and officials, or again, for thousands of years. The field of environmental history of China is a very new one. It's only just getting started. But there really are quite a lot of Chinese and Western scholars who've really done fascinating work on these subjects. And I would just like to introduce a few examples of the kind of work that they've been doing. So I'm going to cover three main topics very briefly. But begin with this one, maybe China's most famous picture, the giant dust storm of 2001 that covered the entire subcontinent of China, to point out the historical roots of this dust storm. Most of the dust in that cloud came from Inner Mongolia and northwest China. Why was all that dust in that cloud? Because the farmers and nomads of that region had been clearing land and raising goats, which produced the lovely cashmere sweaters we all wear, severely causing desertification of the landscape. Much of the land clearance occurred during the Cultural Revolution and created fields with now no water and nothing but dust. Another component of this dust cloud is the pollution of the East Coast, which is, of course, not just a recent problem, but the industrial growth of eastern China begins at least with the city of Shanghai in 1840. So you have the two frontiers of China, the northwest, arid interior of China, and the rich east coast, both producing the elements of this giant dust cloud that went around the world and left its traces everywhere. That's just one example of historical legacies. Here's a brief list of some recent books on Chinese environmental history. In case any of you are interested, I can send you references about them later. There's been a lot more being done in recent years. And the three basic themes that I'll talk about: famine relief, frontier expansion, and response to crises. I will get to water at the end, a bit about floods and spills in rivers at the end. Okay, so famine relief. The officials of China's imperial states frequently discussed famine relief. They knew that there was a constant threat in many places when the harvest failed. It could fail because of drought or flood or insect attacks. And a common statement they often made about famine relief was, "Huang zhang wu shan se." There is no perfect famine relief solution. There never was, there never is. They had to choose. They had to choose between sometimes limited and unsatisfactory alternatives. If the shortages were not too severe, they could sell grain from a very large-scale granary system that the Qing government had set up to level prices. If the shortage was more severe, they could deliver relief supplies in kind. But they could only do that if there was enough transportation to make the region accessible. They could try to get merchants to ship grain to afflicted areas. There they were using the market, just like the people you saw talk this morning, use the market to distribute relief supplies. They could give relief in cash, just give them money to the peasants. But that only worked if there were markets in the famine region. They discussed all of these alternatives, and though they didn't use the word, it pretty much is like Amartya Sen's ideas of entitlements. How do you give famine relief sufferers entitlements so that they can obtain the subsistence guarantees that they need? The other issue with famine relief is migration. Farmers suffering harvest failure would leave the region, naturally enough, to find relief elsewhere, and this gave officials a difficult task. Did you relieve the refugees in feeding centers in other towns? That's one choice. Give out rice gruel to large concentrations of refugees in urban centers. That's the most efficient way to concentrate relief supplies, but it also encourages the spread of disease and aggravates migration and instability. Or should you try to give refugees cash to give them enough travel expense and grain to get back home? Well, that might restrain migration, but then a clever refugee can use those funds and move on to another relief center and keep on going. Welfare dependency. Should they encourage local gentry to distribute relief in villages? You would appeal to Confucian and Buddhist moral norms, encourage benevolence and philanthropy, try to keep a balance of rich and poor. And there were philanthropic gentry activists in imperial China who took this seriously. Some of them wrote very interesting diaries about active participation in famine relief activity. But then there were other gentry, often called lieshen, bad gentry, who just shut their doors, didn't want to be besieged by hungry mobs, and maybe gave their relief only to members of their own clans. This just shows that imperial officials had a variety of policies. None of them worked perfectly well, but they did the best they could to try to relieve some of the suffering population. Some were directed by the state, others relied on autonomous activity by merchants, and some relied on voluntary charitable contributions. Sometimes the state was too weak, our society was too disordered, but sometimes it really actually worked. And there is a large repertoire of policies by famine relief writers that give us a lot of information on how China relieved crises. Well, what's the implication of this for contemporary China's attitude towards disaster relief? Well, until very recently, the party state dominated all relief policy. There were no significant grain markets. The party state refused to allow private actors to participate. But recently, the reformists have begun to realize that private initiative can help out the state when its resources are limited. And officially registered philanthropic societies have proliferated in China in the last 10 or 20 years. Just as the private sector has emerged as a dynamic actor in economic growth, it may also contribute very significantly to our activities related to charitable relief and environmental preservation. We hear the term 社会责任 a lot now, social responsibility. How can this be encouraged in modern Chinese society? So, as I said, it would be wrong to claim that China has no tradition of philanthropic benevolence. Imperial China had a long tradition of this under the Confucian Buddhist tradition. The communist state repressed this entirely, but now many features of pre-communist society are re-emerging in the reform period. This includes lineage organizations, temples, merchant guilds, and all of these associations conduct some form of public good, public charitable activity. If this continues to happen, and if the state looks on it with favor, there will be some interesting choices as to how to enact charitable relief in China. None of them will be perfect, but I think they will reflect some of the choices that officials had to make in the past. Let's look quickly at frontier development. That's another issue where the history of China is quite paramount. Very uncanny echoes from the past are coming up today as the PRC launches a campaign to develop the West, as they call it, to shift rapid economic development from the coastal regions to the interior. This will give special consideration to try to encourage capital investment. We have seen things like the new railroad to Tibet, river navigation to Chongqing made possible by the Three Gorges Dam, and other things of major state infrastructural investment. All of this happened before. The Qing began this in the mid-18th century after they completed the conquest of modern Xinjiang and Mongolia. The Qing officials promoted just about all the same things, not counting industry and railroads: transportation improvement, water conservancy, immigration, land clearance, increased trade, both domestic and international, trade with Russia and the Silk Road. And as a consequence, large waves of Han migrants headed for Xinjiang and Mongolia, stimulated by tax breaks, agricultural subsidies, and they significantly transformed the local ecology. This is the environmental effect of this develop the West policy. They converted grasslands into cultivated fields and expanded the area of oasis agriculture. But more than just the environment changed. Xinjiang became a mixing bowl of different cultures: Han, Mongolian, Turkic, other peoples, who didn't necessarily get along very well. The Qing developers invited some of the Turkic population into northern Xinjiang to help develop oasis agriculture, but the Turkic farmers sometimes saw the Han settlers as infidel invaders, and often there were revolts, and the slogan of jihad was raised in the 19th century to drive out Han migrants. Today, Xinjiang is still tensely divided between immigrant Han, whose numbers are increasing, and resident Uyghurs who fear losing their culture in the face of this Han onslaught. But basically, this political and ethnic conflict has environmental roots. Who will get the most from the development of the rich resources of Xinjiang, including cotton fields, the new cotton fields on the ground, and the oil resources below? Environmental justice, in short, is an issue, I think, in this entire Develop the West program, and it is closely connected to the ethnic issues in China, since the minority peoples of China are the poorest and live in the most remote frontier regions. The resources have changed. We have oil and cotton now when we used to have wheat and grapes, but the underlying structure of conflict remains. Can move to another frontier briefly to see how things worked out a little bit differently. Taiwan. Under the Qing, originally seen as a land of savages, a land of deer hunters and swidden cultivators. In the mid-17th century, the Manchus conquered it and made it for the first time a part of a Chinese empire. The Qing officials debated how to encourage immigration to the island. Han settlers moved in, and these are deer hunters, and transferred intensive cultivation to Taiwan. They grew grain and sugarcane, they exported it, and on the whole, this proceeded fairly peacefully from the point of view of the indigenous inhabitants of Taiwan, and on the whole, I would say this was a sustainable agricultural system. Taiwan used to be a wild and exotic land of savages, and by the 19th century, it became an integral part of the empire. And a lot of this integration of Taiwan was closely connected to its environmental transformation. Taiwan today, as you well know, is a highly developed country with the tallest building in the world, an industrialized country. It's come a long way from the age of savages and deer hunters. That's a different story of frontier development and land transformation. Finally, the last issue I'll go into just quickly on bureaucratic responses to crisis, and just discuss two occurrences of natural disasters that happened 200 years apart to see what kind of continuities there might be between imperial and contemporary China. On July 25th, 1788, 200 years ago, a large surge of water on the Yangtze River broke a dike in the city of Jingzhou in Hubei and flooded the region. and the flood struck 36 counties. The Huguang Governor General said this was just a result of high rainfall. The emperor was a little suspicious. He sent some imperial commissioners in to do a thorough investigation. They found that the real cause of the flood was the expansion of a sandbar in the middle of the Yangtze River, near the Jingzhou city wall. A powerful local family had for 50 years been planting grass illegally on this sandbar, and the effect of this clearance was to direct the Yangtze floodwaters at the base of the city wall, eroding it and eventually flooding the city. And the local officials had failed to challenge this illegal clearance or do anything about the threat to the city. After this was exposed, the imperial state hired 100,000 men to work for 6 months to build a stone embankment. When China attacks a problem with a lot of people, they can get a lot done pretty fast, if they choose to do it, as we know. And the local family lost its rank in the bureaucracy, had its land confiscated, and there was a crime in imperial China. I don't know if it's in current Chinese criminal law, having great wealth and not being benevolent. This was a crime in imperial Chinese law. Maybe we should have such a law. Many local officials who concealed the sandbar were fired or punished. But over the long run, the central state couldn't stop illegal land clearance further flooding. I wrote a book on Dongting Lake in northern Hunan, where much of the same problem happened, and flooding continued to grow in the 19th century. Relief funds didn't stop growing ecological damage. One thing to mention here is there is a concept in the Qing dynasty of public opinion, yulun, the collective view, at least of local elites, who can express their authority through private and personal channels, and sometimes can act for the public good. Sometimes they act for private interests, of course. Sometimes they are in cahoots with local officials. But when the imperial investigators got there, where did they get their data? I mean, they must have got the data about the real story from publicly minded local elites who were not under the thumb of the powerful local family. So they had a range of places to get data from to actually do something about this crisis. That expanded in the early 20th century. In the late 19th century, yulun came to mean other things like mass media, public opinion in the modern sense, newspapers, and potentially this could have opened up new channels to direct social pressures into new reforms. But one thing we do know for sure in history is that the Qing dynasty fell in 1911. It was too little, too late. Let's jump 200 years. Quickly, November 13th, 2005, a series of explosions in a petrochemical plant in Jilin killed at least 6 people, injured at least 70, caused the evacuation of tens of thousands, dumped 100 tons of benzene into the river, created an oil slick 80 kilometers long. The slick went downriver to Harbin and then to the Amur River and the Russian cities of Khabarovsk. This captured international attention, of course, because it crossed an international border. The Chinese government apologized to Russia for the spill, vowed to give Russian officials daily updates on the progress of the oil slick. How did they treat their own citizens? Well, the Jilin officials covered up the accident for at least 4 days. They didn't even inform the local SEPA officials or Heilongjiang downstream. On November 21st, as it approached Harbin, the local officials shut off the water supply and gave no explanation. Later the same day, they did reveal the real cause and started to ship in truckloads of water, but panic buying of water spread. There was mass flight from the city, as you heard yesterday. The slick reached Harbin. Premier Wen Jiabao visited the city. Finally, they restored the water supply. It was a severe but short-term crisis for nearly 4 million people in Harbin and many others in the region. And then the efforts to shift the blame began. Jilin Petrochemical initially denied that the explosion had any connection to the pollution of the river. Jilin officials said their cover-up was, quote, a lie with good intentions, unquote, to avoid public panic. They blamed the state petroleum company. The central investigation team, the imperial commissioners, examined this incident. And the result of that was the head of SEPA resigned, and the deputy head of the petroleum company in Jilin was fired, and the vice mayor of Jilin was found dead in his home by possible suicide. As far as I know, those were the only officials who suffered punishment because of the oil spill. For a brief period, Chinese news media could publish criticisms, and the China Youth Daily said in an editorial that the government should stop lying to the people. And there were foreign reporters, of course, and foreign residents of Harbin who generated more information as well, but pretty soon the news media declared the incident closed and news sources were shut down. In its report on the year 2005, SEPA gave credit to Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao for, quote, making important instructions for many times, unquote. That's the English translation, said more than 300 officials monitored the progress and, quote, effective and down-to-earth work ensured the safety of drinking water along the river. It made no mention of any cover-up or firing of any officials. A UN commission invited by China to investigate the incident positively evaluated China's technical capacities for reducing damage and mildly criticized the inadequacies of communication channels in the bureaucracy and refusal to share information with the public. Well, what does that tell us, these two incidents, about the capacities of the Chinese state to respond to disaster? Well, there were common elements in these two incidents, I think. There was a drive for development led by powerful local actors in collusion with local officials, a disaster with wide effects, which local officials covered up, denied, put lots of people at risk. Central intervention did expose some of the misconduct, brought some punishment, solved the short-term crisis, but the long-term effects, we don't know the long-term effects of the benzene on the animals and the ecological system, and I don't know if studies are being done on that. These were conspicuous incidents because they struck major cities, but they're certainly representative of many others that aren't as well known. And of course, there were new elements in the PRC story because of the international consequences. This made this disaster almost unique in scale and visibility. There's even a Wikipedia article on it. And it had publicity in Chinese newspapers, foreign press for a while, which was then clamped down. So a lot of the local story is still unclear in the PRC. And we really don't know who was responsible or the long-term effects. Though I know we want to move on to the future and China changes, I still think serious investigation of incidents in the past is a good idea to learn lessons about how to avoid them in the future. And we actually know a good deal more about the Qing politics of 200 years ago than we do about this one, because I've seen the archival documents by this central investigation, and we know the history of that family and how the local interests worked and who managed the cover-up and what the public opinion was, and a little bit about the long-term effects. So in short, 20th century crises in China have abundant media exposure sometimes, but what we know about them may be less reliable than what we know about events 200 years ago. And that's part of the problem, the conundrum, the closure of the Chinese bureaucracy to critique. Is China really open? Could it be that the Confucian norm of benevolent rulership and humane education was more effective in getting officials to act for the public good than the technical, managerial, and propagandistic ideologies of the modern party state? Well, it's true that China is changing very rapidly, but China's critical environmental issues are long-standing. They come from fundamental aspects of China: dense population, limited land, heavy pressure on nature, a bureaucratic state, and a genuine appreciation of the aesthetic and spiritual value of nature. So even as China is rushing forward to a new, possibly sustainable ecological system, it needs to look back honestly at the achievements and failures of the past. The classical Chinese saying is, 万古以知新. Re-examine the past to learn about the present. Thank you.
Thanks for Professor Perdue's spatial perspective. Our next speaker will be Professor Chi-yuen Wang from UC Berkeley, and he will sharing his experience and observation on the water supply on northwest China.
Thank you, Hegang, for the introduction, and thank you, Tom, for the invitation to this conference. I'm very excited to be here, to meet, and to learn from many experts in the room. Today, I'll talk about the water supply challenges in China's northwest, and 百闻不如一见. So I will talk about some personal observations on the ground. And China's northwest, as you know, is one of the driest areas in the whole world. And some places has an annual precipitation of less than 50 millimeters per year. Okay, so here's a location map. I'll first take you to, is there a pointer? First, I'll take you to Tarim Basin to see one of the largest deserts in China, and then to Tian Shan. Oh, thank you. And then to Tian Shan to see some glaciers in Tian Shan. And then we'll go to Gansu and look at some water situation there. And here's another Chinese saying, 人定胜天, man can conquer nature. And nowhere in China or in the whole world is this being demonstrated more clearly than in Xinjiang. Xinjiang, as we heard, is one of the Wild West in China. And it consists of some huge mountain ranges and then the largest desert in China, Taklamakan Desert. And Taklamakan in Weiwei means the place of no return, but no longer. Now you can go across the desert in a few hours by automobiles. And here she shows this highway that goes from north to south, and trucks bringing goods across the desert. And what I want to show you mostly is the so-called shelter belts that is built to prevent the migrating sand to cover the highway. It consists of more than 3,000 hectares of salt-resistant plants and over 20,000 of drip pipes to water the plants, and more than 100 stations to pump water for the drip irrigation. And each station is manned by a husband and wife team. Very typical setup in China. And here is just a close-up of the drip pipes, some exposed on the surface. And these are the salt-resistant plants. And here is a water well station that is called Fuqijin in China, husband-wife station. And here is the man. Here's the speaker, not the wife. And the couple is provided with food trucked in. And then there is a TV inside so they can entertain themselves. But otherwise, it's in a very desolated, hardly visited place. And this setup has been so successful that a second highway is being planned. Now we move further north to the Tian Shan mountain. And Tian Shan, as you know, is covered by snow, and there are thousands of small glaciers in the mountain. And the meltwater from the glaciers feeds the rivers. Here is Tarim River, the largest continental river that is without an exit to the ocean in the country. And it's all its tributaries get water from the meltwater from the glaciers. And here's the Tarim River close up. And the water in the river is used mostly for agriculture. The meltwater from the glaciers not only feeds the river, but it also recharges the so-called groundwaters. And the groundwaters are being pumped up also for agricultural purposes mostly. And now let's take a look at the glaciers in Tian Shan. This is the largest glacier in the mountain, which is small in Alaskans' standard, because Tian Shan is so far away from any ocean in the world. But it's the largest in Tian Shan. The glacier is thinning very quickly, and so the number 1 glacier used to be one whole glacier, and now it's broken up because of thinning into 2 branches. It is also retreating very quickly at a rate up to 7 meters per year. So even though there are thousands of glaciers in Tianshan, all are rapidly retreating. And conservative estimates shows that half of the glaciers will be gone in 30 to 50 years, and all in 100 years. These are government estimates, and so they are very conservative. Accelerated melting of glaciers since the 1980s has resulted in a decrease in the glacier storage of water, and which in turn has led to increasing floods, decreasing recharge of groundwater, dropping of water table, and deterioration of environment, and escalating the desertification in the Tarim Basin. And now let's go to Gansu, as I mentioned earlier. And first, we'll go to take a look at the water use in Minqing, and then we'll come back to the Heshi Corridor, which is part of the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road. Minqing is well known for being one of the driest county, one of the driest places in China. And here is a saying by Premier Wen Jiabao: never let Minqing to become the second Lop Nor, which is the symbol, Chinese symbol of desertification. Okay. The Lop Nor, a huge lake, used to be a huge lake, and now is a desert. And here is in Chinese, 绝不能让民情成为第二个罗布泊. Part of Minqing is already gone, abandoned. And here is the monument to commemorate Minqing's people's struggle against desertification. And here the word in Chinese is literally translated as saving water is the key to turn Minqing to mean rich. Minqing means people of diligence. Mean rich, of course, people of richness. But let's see how Minqing people are using the water. When I was there, it was fall of this year. And there's great harvest of all kinds of crops. Red peppers, onions, cotton, and so-called seed melon. What is seed melon? Seed melon is a melon that you don't eat the melon, you harvest the seed. Okay, this is a beloved, not food, but it's something for knickknacks, okay? And it has high commercial values. You can go and eat the melons as much as you want, but you have to leave the seeds alone. So how did the Minqing people get their water? This is almost desert on the surface. They get the water from the underground. From talking to the party secretaries in Minqing, I learned that the quota set by the government is 1 million cubic meter per year of groundwater they can pump. But the actual amount of water pumped is 13 million, 100 million, 1,300 million. That is 13 times the quota that is allowed by the government. Obviously, there's very little regulation of how much water that you can pump out from the ground. Now let's move back to the Heshi Corridor. We'll take a look first. A first thing I want to show you is a surprising occurrence of rising water table in the Heshi Corridor, which is, of course, you know, it's mostly dry. And then I'll take you to the headwaters of this largest river across the Hoshi Corridor, that is Heihe, translated as Black River. Okay, as I mentioned, the Hoshi Corridor is mostly covered by desert pediment. But to the southwest of Hoshi Corridor is this huge mountain, Chi-yuen, which has a lot of moisture and numerous glaciers. And the glacier melt feeds, again, the rivers and many springs in the Hoshi Corridor, which was the stable source water. And also, it feeds a string of oases in the corridor, along which some famous towns has been established historically. Yumen, Jiayuguan, Zhangye, and then Wei. And we'll take a look at these rising springs in Zhangye recently. Okay, since the 1980s, the water table in the Hoshi Corridor has dropped because of overuse of groundwater. In 1992, a famous lake in Zhangye, the Ganquan Lake, which is translated as Sweet Spring Lake, dried up. In 2003, water table in Zhangye unexpectedly stopped to drop but began to rise. In 2005, rising springs invaded many buildings and forced 240 families to abandon their homes, and the Ganquan Lake returned. And there are springs upwelling from the bottom of the lake. So it's a totally surprising thing to see. So, and here are some examples of a flooded basement, a garage, and here you can see watermarks up to 1 meter or so. And large pumps has to be used to get rid of the water. And if you don't have pumps, you have to scoop the water out from your place. And here is a map showing the locations of the rising groundwater. All right. Here, the units are in meters. Here is 1 meter rise in the groundwater level up to a maximum of 6.5 meters. Okay, so there's a lot of water rising up. The area, the total area here is about 200 kilometers. So it's a question, where did all this water come from? And if we know where it comes from, then we can see whether it is sustainable. So we went about, here is a Chinese colleague of mine. We collect waters from the streams and collect waters from the springs. And then we analyze the isotopic tracers in these mountains, and we showed that the water actually comes from more than 4,000 meters high in the Chi-yuen Mountains. So these waters were partially from the melting glaciers, and the increasing melt has increased the recharge of the aquifers and coming out to the Hoshi Corridor to raise the groundwater table. And earthquakes in the 2003, there are 2 magnitude 6 earthquakes that has triggered all this accelerated water circulation. The future, accelerated melting of the glaciers in the Chi-yuen Mountain may have increased the flow of groundwater. All right. If so, the springs will dry up with the vanishing glaciers. And while we were doing fieldworks in Heshi, in Heihe, we happened to see the contaminations, the garbages that's dumped along the side of this headwater of the river. And we also see that houses were built along the river, and if you can see, all these are outhouses at the back of the house that is built right on the side of the Heshi River, waiting for the flood to come in to wash everything down. Here is another picture showing the town of Chi-yuen, which is high in the slope. is dumping all its garbages along the side of the Heshi corridor. While we were looking at this, we heard, let's see, I want to show you some movie, some video clips, as I mentioned here. So if you are sensitive about this, please feel free to leave. Let's see. We heard some whistles, and we turned around. We saw a large herd of lamb were herded into a brick building. And we were wondering about what is this all about. And this building is constructed right on the side of the river. And then, I wish I have a continuous record. Let's see. And then this is the back of the building, right by the side of the river. And we noticed there's a drainage of blood coming out from the backside. So it was a slaughterhouse. And the blood from these just directly dumped into the headwater of Heihe, which is the largest river in the Heshi corridor. And of course, this contaminated water, together with all the garbages, the local people don't ever drink the water from the stream. And the people in Zhangye also know it's not clean, so they all use groundwater. Okay, all this pristine water from snowmelt is wasted. Okay, hope I still have a couple of minutes to summarize. So to summarize, accelerated melting of glaciers in the mountains is probably the most urgent challenge of water supply in China's northwest. The recent rise of springs in the Heshi corridor may be related to an accelerated melting of glaciers in the Chi-yuen mountains and will disappear with the glaciers. Some innovative means are very much needed to stop the runoffs from the mountains and to increase the recharge of the groundwater. I would like to talk to anyone here who has some ideas about how to store up the runoffs so that we can have better recharge of the groundwater. And finally, a lack of environmental awareness in China's rural population may be a basic obstacles in implementing any legislative regulations to protect the available water resources. Thank you.
Thanks for Professor Wang's share of his experiences on Northwest China. And now our next speaker will be Michael Zhao from Asian Society. He will bring us a new documentary on the water and climate situations in Qinghai Tibet Plateau. Actually, he just finished a document on e-dump from his experiences. Now we got an opportunity to enjoy his new works. So welcome.
First of all, thanks to Tom and the conference for having me here. It's glad to be back in Cal. And thanks for Hegang for the introduction. My remarks will be really brief because I'm basically going to show this film. First of all, I'm not a water expert. And secondly, this presentation is much less multimedia than I had planned. But it's one of the examples what my boss Oval and I are trying to do at Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations. Basically, we're trying to build up a online archive of multimedia / documentary projects about China's environmental issues. And this film, when I'm recently producing it, and after the production, I think I will be more and more convinced that this issue, which is I would call the plateau crisis, will be the most important issue for China, at least in the future. As Professor Wang has mentioned, that glaciers will probably be gone in this century on the plateau. And here now, in this time where, is it okay? Thanks. Well, right now we're talking a lot of issues about waters running black, but I think what will be happening pretty soon, as this documentary will show, is that a lot of China's major rivers will be running dry instead of running black or red, whatever color you name it. So without further ado, enjoy the film.
The small hill under the rainbow not only looks special, it is. To a village on the Tibetan plateau, this place is a holy mountain. The Tibetan religion has a long tradition that respects nature and life. Mountains and lakes are a favorite object of worship, and the Tibetan plateau has many of them. Tibetans have lived on the plateau for millennia. The planet should be grateful that these people are also born environmentalists. About the size of Western Europe, the plateau has great biodiversity despite its high altitudes. Known as Asia's water tower, glaciers feed rivers in China, India, and Southeast Asia. The region's importance cannot be overstated. Scientists have found that the plateau is much more sensitive to the global warming than other areas. What's lesser known is that climate change arrived on the plateau a long time ago. An imminent threat endangers not only disappearing glaciers, but also the grasslands and the Tibetans' livelihood. Despite increasing rainfall, The plateau in general has become warmer and drier.
다 소가이 니만로 경바고 다 니만로 자 캐모 다 젠더서 모자도 인치노 다디 니만로 자도 이 공니만로 켜도 있게 한박 선바 캐모 파티 세고 제토는 도축해진 힘든다 진짜 요만도 되니 다 손이나 주세요 다지 되리우리 근데 망던 그 년토 약진 다디 국캬바 바우제티 산창 산창도 그리고
Rains used to drizzle all day long. Now there are short thunderstorms. But after the rain stops, it becomes completely dry. After water evaporates, the grass stops growing.
Zhadaga tanda wuzi, tata zhade la janga, jadung takati ba zhade shasang, tatishin mezi mugzi risong, tendi risong ta zhade ga nyung sempi ga nyung darong ga jirsing, jasaga mezi zugumani, ta tendi nitsi tanda chepa chento mu hyong da sang. Tongda ji meto seti, zari tonda, ta yi jirsing, shadam chidam zuzenda, zadam ramanda jeji, ta tanda zhama uri. Then on cut on that Yentari. Tony Sharik told the chance on the that Itata Chidura. Yamba his on the chance on the Yenton Sashi to turn a cut out on Mori. That and then it's in that Namsar in Carter, that and then Tetrajuma. Session Kitsigina simply to shut him on Jajuri, logs in North in Tazin. Session is in Tash, Shanti Sinji to Varida. So it's all in the Durer. 早上上啊，夏天是牛，那个肉长得好得很。现在还是在不行了，7月份还是在就，变化的多。牛也瘦得很。以前看的时候，今年牛多，还是一个牦牛多，下一个牛多，明年还是下那个牛多重。这个是早上的。 现在看的时候，在那个2年3年就开始牦牛都下不上去。
This is a concern not only for the coming generation on the Tibetan plateau, but also for this one. After thousands of years living in harmony with nature, many Tibetan herdsmen have a tough decision to make: to stay or to migrate.
就经历过工的过节，大年头的老瓜子就是修作的，等你碰到了点开过就是项目，这个项目因为点开过做过就是感谢，现在去的，现在等那大众做过去就帮助就是长期等到就是开采对吧？等到俺路嘛，真的人里面，你就是开采有完没？这个大家没许多，然后就是你看这人去什么来个来头啥就送去，人没得。 Tani tachi hachi mogu chiko. Ta lori anda nitsen jidong ni tachi sen jongdu gaji ta parchi jongdu gas madani samse tonda ga tirsen ta ta semno ojit ta jamsen da utendu.
The Chinese government encourages nomads to move to towns and cities, handing out living allowances for 8 years. But the money sometimes arrives late or in smaller amounts than promised. Furthermore, the relocation policy assumes overgrazing is a main cause of the degradation or desertification of grasslands. But not everybody agrees.
但是这个地方原来有一个节点是为什么生态这样？大家很多说，就是因为当地的老百姓啊，因为当地老百姓是放牧的嘛，所以他们养的牛羊特别多，所以把这个生态质弄坏了。我 觉得我自己是不同意这个观点。其实，如果现在这个干旱化、沙化这样的趋势，它的原因是什么？我也不是说的太清楚。我觉得这个全球气候的变化是个主导因素。当然，再加上这个本身注硬的前提下，又有很多人为的。你比如说，以前这里没有修公路的，现在要修公路，还有一些工程这样的实施的时候，那可能这个陆路的地越来越多，那可能又加速这样的一种趋势变化。所以这些问题。
Influenced by Mandarin culture and migration to cities, younger Tibetans are less likely to practice nomadic husbandry, which is deeply connected to seasonal patterns. Even those deeply skilled in these husbandry techniques find themselves disoriented by the changing climate. Spiritual traditions like this evidence how Tibetans have blended environmentalism into their religion. Adults teach kids to respect animals. Monks don't wear shoes while walking on grass during the summer, the growing season. Despite the Tibetans' efforts to protect nature, global warming has already disrupted the plateau's weather patterns and melted a lot of ice. Scientists have recorded significantly rising temperatures during the past 40 years, and the rate of warming is accelerating. In the past 30 years, glaciers have shrunk by at least 5%. In lower altitudes, over 10%. Melting glaciers may enhance water sources on and around the plateau in the short term, but the region's aggregate water reserve has been running a deficit, an alarming crisis for most of Asia's great rivers. The plateau feeds half of the Yellow River's water, and this source has gone down by almost 25% in 30-some years.
The glaciers of Animachan Mountain feed water into the Yellow River. But between 1966 and 2000, most of the glaciers shrunk by about 17%. Scientists say the ice is now melting 10 times faster than in the previous 300 years. In the last quarter of a century, Halong Glacier has lost significant amounts of ice. Since 1966, the glacier has retreated about 400 meters.
During two recent investigation trips, Greenpeace learned about the inconvenient truth from those affected firsthand.
tene nam da ten lo ni shu da jin na lo ju jing le nam shi jun da sik da sim ma so ta tene da lo shi sum te ara nam shi jun da sim ma so na ni ne nam gu ga lo da wa ju ji ju ni de pe chang bo tang bo te da ta ta da na gun do na ba 약간 낭싱 초보 캬바 타면 더 봐. 이제는 나와 편다 니바 수바 시바 샤로 텐데도 남시 하장야 보여요. 단단 남시리 딱딱 찍다 되겠는데 이마지 나는 남시 담아 숨데 시데 된다 주로도. 되달에 때나 테네 하장 섬는 나라 시버지 제제 지그러지도.
我感觉88年从88年到03年这段这几年的时间呢，消融的厉害。从河水看就能看出消融的厉害，而且这龙浦河的河水呢， 也是越来越多。也是因为这个河，因为我们去年的河很好过的，是用什么强过的，但今年呢很难过。你要没有车的话，过这条河很难过。哎，原来上面冰湖很小，也很少，但现在你们要上去看的冰湖很大，也很多，说它冰川消融呢也比较厉害。
而青藏高原呢，作为一种生态环境脆弱地区，对全球变暖的响应呢是非常敏感，也是非常显著的。我们背后的那座山呢，就是世界上最高峰珠穆朗玛峰，它的下面呢我们中国境内有3条比较著名的冰川，分别是东农部、中农部和西农部。这3条冰川呢，从我们60年代开始的科学考察来看呢，都处于一种退缩状态，而且呢，就是退缩的速度在80年代以后呢，基本上有一种很加速的状态。这些冰川的末端，在30-40年来，大概退缩了200米到300米。
Chinese climate experts say average temperatures in the region have been rising drastically in recent years. In 2006, they reported the highest summer temperature ever recorded in the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau.
中绒部冰川、东绒部冰川都已经退缩了超过300米，并且绒部冰川还在加速消融。绿色和平现在呼吁立即采取行动，发展可再生能源，减少对化石能源的依赖。
Tibetan monks believe that goddesses are protecting Everest and the other mountains in the region. But despite their faith, climate change is already affecting their traditional way of life.
Thanks, Michael. Actually, my colleagues in China Climate Action Network have delivered some messages from Bali conference. The first note I want to add is the IPCC, the fourth assessment report. Why I mentioned that? Because each report there will be new progress about the climate negotiations. The first report is helped to initiate a lot on common sense on climate change. And the second report actually is promotion of the UNFCCC and sold the Kyoto Protocol. And the fourth, hopefully it will start a new post-Kyoto roadmap. So Australia is a star in the first day for the new premier committed to ratify Kyoto Protocol, and also a big commitment to emission reduction about 50% until 2030. So the main purpose of the Bali conference is negotiated for the post-Kyoto roadmap. So when we are asking what US where is the US, and also we need to ask where is China. Our questions actually, if China won, China can take leadership, and then how and why China can or cannot take the leadership. So I'm going to talk some basic principles or ideas of our article, and we are proposing some new mechanisms for the post-Kyoto negotiation or process. And proactive is our core ideas or core values when we considering adaptation, mitigation, and also the technology and the financial mechanisms. Some actions or cases we are going to stress, and also is climate change an challenge or opportunity for China. So the basic principles for our idea is that sustainability, when we take the history of the climate change, actually it's why climate change come into a problem. Actually, it's the start of the industrial revolution. This delivers a strong message that the development model, that the Western style development is not sustainable, is unsustainable. So when we read back the China, China has a 5,000 non-traditional culture. So we do believe that this can be a big contribution, or it's kind of a tank of the wisdom from the traditional China culture and practice of the balance between human and nature. So our second principle is that it's equity. The primary or the prime question we are asking that is how on earth can we live together? It's a century or it's a year that we should live together. Actually, when we discuss this question in the Terrible Forum in Sweden, so this should be our main consideration. Actually, the common but differentiated responsibility is also under this equity consideration. And so what we are proposing for the new mechanism to facilitate the post-Kyoto process. As you know, there's a dual track. We call it UNFCCC, and the Kyoto Protocol is under the process. And actually, now the consideration of US and the developing countries is under the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol because it has a quantitative commitment, but some developing countries and the US didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So we call it dual track process. So beyond that, how we get more involvement of US or China or developing countries, so we think D6 is comparatively to G8. As you know, 6 may include 6 big developing countries like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, and Indonesia. These 6 big developing countries, their population totally will add to 1/2 of the world population, and the economy is about 2/3 of the developing countries. So if this can be a new mechanism, it will get a strong leverage to the G8 + 5 region. And a second is China-India dialogue. This is in the D4 region. So they're asking that if China and the US can work together, there should be no, I kind of say no climate problem. But if China and India work together in the developing world, it should be a big change. And other tracks including EU, China, US, China, Australia, China. I should suggest that it's not a replacement of the dual track UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. But it's a substitute. There is 3 voices that why China does not act. The first voice is that for the development emission, because China is a developing country, and we have more than 1 million people still live in $1 standards of the UN standards. So, and also a lot of people even in city, in urban areas, they are still on that level. So developing countries' rights for development is still be necessary. We also call it a necessary emission. It's a comparison to the so-called luxurious emission of advanced countries. And the second verse is the historic emission. As developed countries has a non-emission history, and now we in the process of development. Why we cannot? So the historic emission should be in the consideration and equally separated. And another thing, as Professor Zhang also mentioned, the transmission emissions. There is a new report by Tendere Climate Research Center that actually 23% of China's total emission is by export sector. That means 23% of China's emission is consumed by Western countries. So how China's climate strategy can be proactive. So it should be, or it can be, an opportunity for China's sustainable development. I will interpret this idea later. And it's also an opportunity for China's image building. When we are saying peaceful rising and or peaceful development for big, responsible developing country. And it's also proactive for China as a big country to take global leadership. How to be proactive? I will be interpret this idea through the so-called four tiers or four cores. And the first is mitigation. The 11th five-year plan, I don't need to add more words on that, but one message that I want to deliver is that for the environment protection 11th five-year plan, they specifically add greenhouse gas into this plan. Actually, in the 11th plan, it didn't include the greenhouse gas as a pollutant. That's the biggest, I think it's a big message. And the 3 stream or 3 regulation is newly developed for the implementation of the emission reduction. So why we cannot have a quantitative goal? We can think in the baseline or in the per capita baseline to when we reach the world average, can we have a quantitative goal to commitment for the emission reduction? So for the adaptation perspective, just as I mentioned before, the export-oriented economy is 1%, means that if you conduct emission reduction policy, it will impact your economy greatly. And we also in so-called Xization, industrialization, urbanization, modernization. This is a process that means you need more energy to in the globalization process. And agriculture, and also China have a lot of poor area and ecological fragile area for the diversified ecosystem. So self-adaptation, beyond self-adaptation, to help least developing countries and small island countries, especially Africa. When China search resources in Africa, also need to help Africa or African people to adapt to climate change. So from the technology perspective, industries like chemical, steel, cement, and architecture should be the major industry sectors. And for the fields, energy efficiency, energy conservation, and renewable energy, clean coal. As time is come to close, and go it quickly. For the finance, and I want to mention that the China CDM fund, it will be the first fund dropped the money from the clean development mechanism, but will be used specifically to the tackling climate change is the first fund used specifically for climate change and sustainable development. And an article mentioned by Maurice Strong, it proposed $1 trillion US used for the UN, especially for the climate, and some action cases. It's just cases for consideration. Actually, one possibility is for the global 50 zero emission communities, just as Professor Harrison will be talk a little bit in the afternoon section. And for the nature conservation leadership, the main idea of these cases is for implementation. It's not just that we take the total renewable energy in the emission communities, zero emission communities, and it can be selective by different cultures, even different religions. It's under the equity idea that how we can live together. We should first learn each other. So it's crisis or opportunity, and its opportunity or climate change can be an opportunity for a sustainable development model that can be contribute to the world. And second, it's an opportunity for innovative infrastructure and innovative culture. And it's an opportunity for China's transition from a manufacturer-based economy to a knowledge-based economy. And it can be an opportunity for new forces for the system reform and the rule of law. And also, it's an opportunity for the public participation and the implementation practice. So I would like to end with this, that as local language and the global voice, think locally and think globally and act locally is a slogan. But I want to say we need to both think and act both locally and globally. Thank you. Now we'll have 5 minutes round to have a question and answer section. So, okay. I think the woman in the back. Okay. The woman. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. My name is Daniela Saliver. I'm with a local NGO called Pacific Environment. This question is for the whole panel, and it really comes off following Mr. He's final comment, which is thinking locally and also acting locally. And I think we spent a better part of the past day talking at the big picture level, policy, climate change. But what can be done to address some of these local issues on the ground in China in communities like the ones Dr. Wang has spent time doing research in on really critical issues like water pollution?
The whole panel? Okay.
I'll give you a simple answer. He mentioned popular participation. To put it a little more sharply, civil society. Local communities need to have opportunities to act and to communicate with each other and publicize their environmental problems without interference from state and other local agents.
Education probably is very important. Education up to the general public about their water resources, and it has to be coordinated with the government, local government. So you have to approach the problem on both ends. One is the population have to recognize the importance of protecting the environment. At the same time, you get the cooperation from the government. So it's a long process.
Well, I think from a journalistic perspective, we need to do a lot of work to communicate the problems in the wild to people on the plains. And especially with this film, before I made the trip, I didn't know that they have all these kind of problems, except, glaciers are melting. When I went there, I learned all this, and it's just so eye-opening. And the key problem for them is to communicate the problems to the outside world. They can communicate pretty well with Tibetans up on the plateau, but not to most Chinese, let alone the whole world. So I think that's really important for them and for a lot of other communities.
Okay.
On April 17 last year, 330,000 tons.
Please keep the question and
the question is very important. I'm saying something. 330,000 tons of yellow sand falling down in Beijing, the capital. And later on, it flowed to the east, muddy rain coming down in Korea and Japan. And then cross Pacific Ocean, falling down in California. And 6 months ago, it crossed the dust, crossed Rocky Mountain, falling down in Denver. So this is a global issue. It's not only an issue in China. I am currently the executive director of China Foundation for Desertification Control, and also the executive director of ELSA Ecological Association.
Excuse me, could I just ask you to make that a question? We have very little time. Could you just make one question, please? We have very little time. We are only taking questions.
Emphasize this means
yes,
this
but I'd
is
like
a
to hear a
global
question from
issue,
you.
so that we should hand in hand work together, but not like, I have seen Mr. Zhang, unfortunately, didn't come here.
Thank you. Can we have time for other people to ask questions?
Don't blame China. Put all the claims on China as a Christmas tree. Thank you.
More questions, please. Over there.
Okay.
Jan Goldsmith. I'm a water attorney from Sacramento. I specialize in water rights and water processes in California. And one of the similar kinds of situations that California faces in terms of increasing floods and winter rains and periods of drought and flood increasingly is being addressed by the issue of, or the technique of conjunctive use, where you use the surface water when it's available and you save the groundwater for when it isn't. And in Professor Wang, in your speech, it looked as though what really needs to happen is preserving that groundwater supply for what you know is coming, which is a loss of the glacier flows, and using the surface water in the meantime. And the primary impediment from your speech was that there is very little investment or capacity for treating surface waters or pollution prevention. And I was wondering if you could comment on what the institutional and financial impediments are toward getting the kinds of water treatment facilities and public education and financial investment that's required. I know that because it's a poor region of China, it's going to have to be more than just a local effort.
Currently, there's very little public education towards this oncoming crisis. But the researchers in China are keenly aware of the problem, but has not yet publicized it or has conducted any public education programs. But the time is very short, and the time to act is now. So somehow, I think from outside, we could promote this feeling of the criticalness and try to get some program going. I agree with you that the same problem is occurring in California, and we may start some program here in California, and try to use that as a model to implement in China.
One more question.
Just a follow-up question, is there any potential for getting Chinese national funding and financing for this problem, which is really at the headwaters of China's rivers?
At this moment, I don't know any. Yeah. We have to raise the awareness in that direction.
Okay. The lady.
For any of the speakers, a very simple question. What do we know about the impacts of climate change on China's rivers? We know that the glaciers are melting, but overall, have there been studies that examine this problem for river systems in China?
If we don't do anything, I think the rivers are going to dry up. Yeah, we need to do something to balance, to compensate the loss of storage in the glaciers right now, and to store up the water to replace the function of glacier as a storage. Yeah. We need to find innovative ways to do that. And I can talk to you. I have some ideas, but.
Okay, as our time is limited, so thanks again for the distinguished speakers. So thanks.